Okay, let's start today with a little bit of a mental exercise. I want you to just close your eyes for a second. When I say the phrase the Trojan War, what is the very first image that pops into your head?
Oh, that's easy. It's definitely Brad Pitt in shiny armor looking absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's a giant wooden horse being wheeled into a fortified city. Or, the face that launched 1,000 ships thing.
Exactly right. It's the ultimate blockbuster movie setup. We all have these cultural touchstones ingrained in us from cartoons or movies or maybe just a hazy memory of a high school history class.
Okay.
But here is where it gets really interesting and honestly kind of a little shocking. We've been digging into a really fascinating deep dive source today. It's a detailed review of the Iliad by Homer, but specifically analyzing the audiobook experience of it. And this source material makes a pretty wild claim right out of gate.
It really does. And it's a claim that might completely shatter that mental image you just had.
Yeah, the claim is basically that the movie playing in our heads, it's completely wrong. And not just like, oh, Hollywood got the Bronze Age costumes wrong type of wrong. It is fundamentally missing the point of what the story actually is. I mean, for example, looking at the actual text, there is no wooden horse in the Iliad.
No horse at all.
There's no death of Achilles.
Right, he's very much alive when the poem ends.
It doesn't even cover the whole war.
Not even close.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a tiny fraction.
So we're sitting here realizing that one of the most famous stories in human history is actually kind of a total mystery to most of us. And that creates a bit of a crisis for the modern reader, right? Because you
Yeah.
pick up this massive brick of a book expecting this sweeping start-to-finish war chronicle, and instead you get something, well, kind of very distinct.
You get something incredibly dense, complex, and honestly, often deeply misunderstood by modern audiences.
Which brings us to the actual mission for our deep dive today. We aren't just going to sit here and summarize a 3,000-year-old poem for you. We want to figure out why this specific reviewer argues that to really understand the Iliad, to actually truly get it, you shouldn't read it at all. You actually need to listen to it.
Right. It's the argument that modern technology, specifically, really good pair of noise-canceling headphones, might actually be the exact key we need to unlocking the oldest story in the Western canon.
So let's unpack this together. The source material starts by laying some basic groundwork. We know it's old, but can we get a bit more specific? What are we actually dealing with here historically?
We are dealing with a foundational work composed somewhere around the 8th century BCE, but the word composed is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. We really have to remember that Homer, and that's if he even existed as a single person, which is a whole other massive academic debate, he didn't sit down at a mahogany desk with a quill and parchment to write a fantasy novel.
Right, he wasn't trying to write a New York Times bestseller.
No, not at all. He was composing this in a very specific format called dactylic hexameter.
Okay, dactylic hexameter. I see this term in the source notes, and I have to be completely honest, it sounds like a medical condition. Like, I'm sorry, sir, you've been diagnosed with dactylic hexameter. Can you break that down for us? Why does a modern listener listening on their commute care about ancient Greek rhythm?
Because it is literally the engine of the entire experience. You have to think of it like a drum beat. He goes, eat, da da dee do da da. That specific meter is the heartbeat of the poem. It wasn't designed for the eye to scan on a page. It was designed strictly for the ear. It's a performance piece. In many ways, it's actually much closer to modern hip-hop or spoken word poetry than it is to a paperback novel you'd pick up at an airport terminal.
Oh, wow. Okay, so the argument the source is making is that when we sit down to read it silently, which is how 99% of us first encounter it, usually while panicking before a literature test in high school, we actually breaking the medium itself.
Yes. The review makes this point very explicitly. When you try to read the text silently, your brain is suddenly doing this massive amount of cognitive heavy lifting. You're trying to decode all these strange ancient names. You're trying to track the weird syntax, and you're unconsciously trying to force a rhythm that just isn't natural to English prose. You are basically fighting the text every step of the way.
Man, that resonates with me so much. I remember I've tried to read it in the past and it feels so choppy, like you get stuck on those famous epithets. You know, the ones like swift-footed Achilles or rosy-fingered Dawn. On the page when you read swift-footed Achilles for the 50th time in 3 chapters, it feels super repetitive. You're just sitting there like, okay, I get it. The guy runs fast. Can we please move on to the action?
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
But in an oral performance, those phrases aren't repetitive filler at all. They are anchors. They are musical beats. When you listen to the audiobook, those repeated phrases actually give you a second to breathe. to process the crazy thing that just happened before the next wave of action hits you. The source argues strongly that audio wins because it restores that crucial oral connection.
So it's really an authenticity factor.
It is. Listening to a skilled narrator puts you right back in the position of the original ancient Greek audience. You know you're sitting around a fire, or in our modern case, you're stuck in awful bumper-to-bumper traffic, and someone is just weaving a spell for you. You aren't sitting there analyzing the sentence structure. You're just receiving the story the way it was meant to be received.
Let's talk about that spell for a second, because the review praises the production value of these audiobooks really heavily. It specifically mentions vocal gravitas. Now, is this just about having a narrator with a deep, booming movie trailer kind of voice?
It's a lot more than just sounding cool over a microphone. It's really about character distinction.
Hmm.
In the actual text, everyone speaks in this very high, formal, poetic style. So on the physical page, King Agamemnon and Achilles can look very similar because they both use the same kind of flowery, grand language. But a skilled voice narrator, and the reviews usually point to heavy hitters doing these like Dan Stevens or Alfred Molina, they actually inject real human personality into those formal lines.
So you can actually hear the arrogance dripping from the words.
Exactly. You hear the literal sneer in Agamemnon's voice. You hear the petulance and the unhinged fire in Achilles. You hear the absolute bone-deep exhaustion in Hector. It helps the listener track the complex politics of the Greek camp without needing to constantly flip back to a character flowchart.
That's such a great point about the politics, because that leads us perfectly into the actual plot of the story. We mentioned earlier that most people have the entirely wrong movie playing in their heads. The source has this whole section dedicated to busting myths, and I really want to dive into that right now.
Yes, not the whole war surprise.
Yeah, I think this is probably the biggest hurdle for people coming to it fresh. The Trojan War famously lasted 10 long years. The Iliad covers... What does the source say it actually covers?
It covers about 52 days.
52 days. Out of 10 years, that is microscopic.
It is a tiny slice of life. Well, actually more like a slice of death given the body count.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's focused entirely on a few weeks at the very end during the 10th year. But crucially, it completely stops before the actual end of the war.
So if it's not the grand complete story of the Trojan War, what on earth is it the story of? The source identifies a very specific inciting incident, and it is definitely not Paris kidnapping Helen of Troy.
No, not at all. Helen is barely even in this poem, actually. The core story isn't Greeks versus Trojans. The core story is Achilles versus Agamemnon. It is an internal dispute among the Greeks themselves.
It's essentially a workplace dispute.
Honestly,
Yeah.
yes, that is the perfect way to describe it. It's a violent workplace dispute over the division of the spoils of war. Agamemnon, who is the high king of the Greek forces, uses his rank to basically confiscate a war prize, a captive woman named Briseis, away from Achilles, who is by far his best fighter. He just completely disrespects him in front of the entire management team, basically.
And Achilles, being famously the greatest of the Greeks, doesn't exactly take this HR violation very well.
He goes completely nuclear. He doesn't just get mad, he formally quits. He essentially goes on strike right in the middle of a war zone. He literally marches back to his tent, sits down, and says, "All right, good luck fighting Hector and the Trojans without me. I genuinely hope you all get slaughtered."
That is incredibly petty for a legendary superhero.
It is deeply petty, but that exact pettiness is the spark that ignites the entire epic.
And this brings us right to the core themes of the deep dive. Because the source makes it clear this isn't just a story about a guy pouting in his tent. The review highlights that the very first word of the Iliad in the original ancient Greek is menin.
Menin, which translates roughly to rage or wrath.
So theme number one is the rage of Achilles. The source emphasizes that this isn't just normal everyday anger. It's described as almost cosmic in its scale.
It really is. And the reviewer points out how perfectly the entire plot structure is mapped directly to the trajectory of this rage. It starts out as somewhat justified indignation. You know, I was dishonored by my boss. But then as the days go on, it festers. It turns into this toxic, destructive pride. Even when the Greeks are actively getting slaughtered on the beaches and they send these desperate embassies to beg him to come back with massive apologies and gifts, he flat out refuses.
So he is literally willing to let his best friends die violently just to prove a point to Agamemnon.
Just to protect his honor, yes. And this is exactly where we have to talk about theme number two from the source. The ancient concept of kleos.
Kleos. Okay, so the source defines this as honor and glory, but I feel like that English translation doesn't really quite capture the immense weight of it. Like in a modern context, glory is like, I don't know, winning a Super Bowl. It's nice. You get a shiny ring, maybe you get a parade down Main Street, but it's not a literal matter of life or death.
Right. We view glory as a bonus.
Mhm.
But for the ancient Greeks, Kleos was literally the only form of an afterlife that was available to them. They didn't have this belief in a lovely heaven where you reunite with your family and play the harp on a cloud. When you died, you went down to Hades. And Hades was this damp, dark, miserable underground place where everyone, whether you were a great king or a lowly slave, just became a mindless, squeaking shadow.
Wow, that is incredibly bleak. So the only way to actually live on is to make sure you're remembered by the living.
Exactly. You need to do something on Earth so spectacular, and usually in this culture that meant something incredibly violent or exceptionally brave, that the poets will still be singing your name 500 years after you turn to dust. Kleos is basically acoustic immortality.
Acoustic immortality. That is such a fascinating phrase, and it brings it right back to the audiobook medium.
It really does. Think about it. If you are listening to the story right now through your headphones as you walk the dog, you are actively participating in Achilles' immortality project. You are giving him the exact Kleos that he died to achieve. You are keeping him alive in your ears.
That is actually really meta when you think about it, but it totally explains why he is so intensely obsessed with the public disrespect from Agamemnon. If the king disrespects him and takes his prize, he isn't just hurting his ego, he's literally threatening his eternal soul.
Precisely. It's an existential threat. If he isn't respected, there is no glory. If there is no glory, there is no song. And if there is no song, he ceases to exist completely.
Okay, but there is a major flip side to this relentless pursuit of glory, and that brings us to theme number 3, which is fate versus free will. The source mentions the gods a lot, Zeus, Hera, Athena, and how much they intervene in the human battles. In the audiobook production, these gods are presented as very distinct characters, right?
Oh, very much so. And they are terrifying, primarily because they are so insanely petty. They treat this horrific, brutal human war like it's a casual board game on a Sunday afternoon. They have mortal favorites, they constantly cheat against each other, they bicker endlessly, but underneath all of their divine games, there is this much heavier theme that the source notes. Achilles actually knows his own fate. He has a divine prophecy actively hanging over his head.
Right, he has two very clear choices.
Yes. Choice A is he can pack up his ships, go home to Greece, marry, have a bunch of kids, live to be a happy old man, and be completely forgotten by history. No Kleos at all. Choice B is he can stay at Troy, fight, die incredibly young, never see his father again, but achieve eternal, unfading fame.
And spoiler alert, he chooses death.
He chooses death. But, and this is what the audiobook performance captures so incredibly well in the later sections of the story, he really struggles with it. He doesn't just blindly accept it. He questions the entire warrior code. There is this brilliant scene where he basically yells at the other kings and says, "I would rather be a living slave to a poor dirt farmer than be the glorious king of all the dead."
Man, that is heavy. And that actually leads us perfectly to what the review argues is the absolute strongest part of the audio experience. Theme number 4, the human cost of the war. Because we always think of the Iliad as just endless battle scenes, swords clashing, bronze shields, breaking chariots crashing. But the source argues the most powerful moments are actually the quiet, intimate ones.
The conversations, the brief, fleeting moments where the brutal war just stops for a second and you finally see the vulnerable people trapped underneath all that bronze armor.
Yeah, one specific scene that really stood out in the review is the interaction between Hector and his wife, Andromache. Can you set that scene up for us so we understand what's happening?
Sure. So Hector is the ultimate champion of Troy, and he's kind of the good guy of the whole epic, really. He isn't fighting for spoils or massive ego like Achilles. He's just fighting desperately to defend his home and his family. In this scene, he goes back inside the city walls to say a quick goodbye to his wife and his infant son before heading back to the slaughter. He's fully geared up for combat, wearing his massive helmet, which has this big, terrifying horsehair crest on the top.
And he goes to hug his baby, and the baby just completely freaks out.
The baby starts screaming in terror. He recoils away from his own dad. Because he doesn't recognize his father, he just sees this terrifying, towering monster of war leaning over him. And Hector, this ultimate killing machine who's been slaughtering Greeks all morning, he just laughs. A real warm dad laugh. He takes the scary helmet off, sets it down in the dust, and picks up his son. He kisses him and he prays out loud to the gods that his son will grow up to be a much better man than he is.
And the whole time he's doing this, he absolutely knows he is walking right back out to his own death.
He knows it in his bones. And his wife, Andromache, she knows it too. The review specifically notes that when you're listening to the audiobook, just hearing this sudden gentleness and softness in Hector's voice during that moment, contrasting so sharply with the screaming violence before and after it, it is just devastating. It humanizes the supposed enemy in a way that, honestly, even modern war propaganda rarely ever manages to do.
The other major emotional scene the source highlights is the actual climax of the poem. And again, spoiler alert for a 3,000-year-old story, it is not a giant sword fight. It's actually a secret meeting between King Priam, who is Hector's elderly dad, and Achilles.
This is undoubtedly the soul of the entire book. By this point, Achilles has finally returned to the battle. He has hunted down and killed Hector. He has brutally desecrated the corpse by tying it to his chariot and dragging it through the dirt for days. He is entirely lost to his own rage. He has functionally become a monster.
And then old King Priam breaks into his tent in the dead of night.
Yes. This frail, grieving old man sneaking past the entire Greek army into the enemy camp in the dark. And he walks right up to the terrifying Achilles, drops to his knees, and kisses the hands of the man who literally murdered his favorite son.
There's that incredible quote from the translation, "I have done what no other man has done. Kiss the hand of the man who killed my child."
It genuinely chills you just to hear it. In the audio version, the source claims that the sheer silence described in that tent, the raw sound of the weeping, it just hits you right in the gut. It is the exact moment that Achilles' cosmic rage finally just shatters. The two of them just sit there and weep together. Not crying for the war or for a victory, but just weeping for the universal awful suffering of being a human being.
That's shared humanity. That is the real payoff. That's why we are still talking about this poem today. But I do want to play devil's advocate for just a minute here before we wrap up, because we are painting a very road-moving picture of this listening experience. But the source deliberately includes a reality check section. Because let's face it, it's not all just emotional weeping and cool poetic rhythms.
No, it is definitely not. Sometimes it's a massive grind.
The very first hurdle the review mentions is repetition. We talked earlier about how the epithets can be helpful anchors, but what about the sheer amount of violence?
The violence is insanely graphic, and it is absolutely relentless. Homer acts almost like a battlefield anatomist. He doesn't just say a guy died. He tells you exactly which specific tendon the bronze spear severed. He tells you how the darkness came swirling down to cover their eyes. He tells you exactly how their teeth shattered against the dirt, over and over again.
And the thing with an audiobook is you can't just skim past that.
You really can't. If you're reading a physical book, you might naturally let your eyes glaze over a dense paragraph describing some minor background character getting speared. But in audio, you are trapped with the narrator. You have to sit with it. You have to hear the squelch of every hit. The source readily admits that for a modern listener, this can become deeply exhausting. It can start to feel repetitive, like, oh, another guy named something Achilles died. Okay, I get it. War is bad.
Then there is the structural complexity, specifically the infamous catalog of ships.
Oh, God, the catalog. Book 2. It is literally just a geographical list of every single Greek commander, where they came from, and exactly how many ships they brought to the beach. And it goes on for something like 20 or 30 solid minutes in the audiobook.
It is quite literally an accounting spreadsheet presented in poem form.
It is exactly that. And the source warns listeners that this is the precise moment where most people just give up and quit. In audio, it can actually be kind of mesmerizing if you manage to treat it almost like a hypnotic chant. But it is undeniably a massive hurdle for narrative pacing. And the names. There are just so many names thrown at you. You're driving along thinking, wait, is this Ajax the Greater or Ajax the Lesser talking right now? Who is Diomedes again? Is he the guy who threw the giant rock earlier?
Yeah, without a visual glossary at the back of the book to flip to, you can get lost so fast.
You can. The primary advice in the review, though, is basically just don't worry about it too much. Trust the text. Trust that the main players, Achilles, Hector, Agamemnon, Odysseus, will make themselves known through their actions. Let all the other minor names just wash over you like background noise in a busy, crowded room.
And lastly, they mention the language barrier. Depending heavily on the specific translation you choose, it can sound incredibly archaic.
Right, a lot of thee and thou and over-formal syntax. The review strongly suggests picking a modern translation specifically designed for flow, like the Robert Fagel's translation or the newer Emily Wilson translation, just to avoid feeling like you're sitting in a rigid King James Bible study class. The translation choice matters immensely for the audio flow.
Okay, so we have the brutal repetition, the wildly confusing cast of thousands, and the sheer graphic intensity of the violence. And yet, after all of that, the source's final verdict,
The source still gives the experience a solid 9 out of 10.
which is a massive score for a piece of media that apparently requires that much active mental homework.
It is. But the reviewer's reasoning is that the grand cinematic payoff is entirely worth the high price of admission, the sheer scale of it all. When the clash between Achilles and Hector finally happens, it doesn't just feel like two tough guys fighting in the dirt. It literally feels like two tectonic plates colliding and shaking the earth. A great narrator brings that raw energy to life in a way that just makes you completely forget the difficult, dense parts.
It sounds like what the reviewer is ultimately saying is, yes, it is hard work, but the best, most rewarding things in life usually are.
Exactly. The audio format somehow manages to turn a dusty history lesson into a visceral living experience.
Hmm.
It stops being academic homework and starts being real life.
So, wrapping all this up, if you are sitting there listening to us right now and you've always been intimidated by the so-called classics, or you've always thought the Iliad is just a bunch of dusty old men in togas debating ancient philosophy.
The main takeaway is this. The audiobook format is your secret backdoor entry into the canon. It completely bypasses the intense struggle of reading the poetic meter with your eyes and plugs you directly back into the original oral tradition. If you enjoy sprawling political epics like Game of Thrones, or if you love intense historical fiction, this poem is quite literally the original DNA of all of that media.
It's the ancient source code.
It really, truly is.
And I want to leave everyone today with one final thought, just something to maybe mull over on your own that really struck me from the source's conclusion. We talked earlier about exactly how the story ends. It doesn't end with the famous trick of the Trojan horse. It doesn't end with a massive, glorious victory parade for the Greeks.
There is no mission accomplished banner hanging over the ruins of Troy.
No, it ends with a funeral. It ends with two bitter mortal enemies crying together in a dimly lit tent, suddenly recognizing each other's profound pain.
Which is remarkably, profoundly anti-triumphant for the most famous war story ever told.
So here is the question for you to take away. We live in a modern world that really loves clear-cut winners and losers. We absolutely love the victory lap. But the ancients, these people who lived in a hyper-violent warrior culture who openly valued military glory above literally everything else, they actively chose to end their greatest defining epic with shared grief instead of victory. What does that tell us about how they truly viewed the ultimate cost of human conflict compared to how we view it today?
Wow, that is a heavy, vital question. Honestly, maybe they understood the core tragedy of it all far better than we do.
Definitely something to think about the next time you put your own headphones on. Thanks so much for diving in with us today.
Always a pleasure.